Close your eyes and put yourself there. You are standing on a vast slope of bare, grey concrete, packed shoulder to shoulder with 200,000 strangers. There are no seats, there is no roof. There is only the bowl, rising around you in every direction until the people at the very top are smaller than the grass below. Somewhere down there, impossibly far away, 22 men are about to decide the fate of a nation. And when the ball moves, the sound that comes back at you is not cheering. It is a physical thing. A wall of noise that hits your chest, climbs the concrete, and rolls back down again, until you cannot tell whether the roar is coming from the crowd or from inside your own ribs. This is the Maracanã in Rio de Janeiro on the 16th of July, 1950. And on that afternoon, it was the largest crowd ever to watch a game of football. A record that has now stood for more than 70 years, and one that will almost certainly never be broken. This is the story of the biggest and the smallest stadiums in the history of the World Cup. The cathedrals and the cupboards, the bowls that swallowed a city, and the little club grounds where the whole thing began in front of a few hundred shivering souls. Because the World Cup is not just played in stadiums. The stadiums are part of the story. Let us begin with the giant. When Brazil was awarded the 1950 World Cup, the country decided it would not simply host the tournament. It would build the greatest monument football had ever seen. In the heart of Rio, they poured a colossus of concrete, an oval so enormous that when it opened, it was by some distance the largest stadium on Earth. The official figures argued with each other for decades. Brazilian authorities claimed it could hold more than 200,000 people. The record books settled lower, around 180,000. But the truth is that nobody really knew, because most of the Maracana was not seats at all. It was a sweeping bank of standing terraces, and you simply kept letting people in until there was no more room to stand. On the day of the deciding match, they let in nearly everyone. The verified figure is 199,854. The official paid attendance was around 173,000, but with the gate crashers, the children lifted over turnstiles, the bodies wedged into every gap. The real number was almost certainly past 200,000. No football match before or since has ever been watched in person by so many human beings at once. And here is the cruel poetry of it. They built the biggest stadium in the world to crown themselves champions. Brazil only needed a draw against tiny Uruguay. They scored first. 200,000 people stood on the edge of ecstasy. And then Uruguay scored twice. Schiaffino, then Giggia, and with that second goal, the most famous silence in the history of sport fell over the largest crowd in the history of sport. 200,000 people struck dumb in the same instant. They still call it the Maracanazo, the biggest stadium ever built, and on its greatest day, it broke its own nation's heart. But to find where all of this started, you have to go backwards. 20 years backwards, and far smaller. The very first World Cup in 1930 was held in Uruguay, a country of fewer than 2 million people. To stage it, they promised the world a magnificent new arena. They called it the Estadio Centenario, built to mark 100 years of Uruguayan independence. It was meant to be the beating heart of the tournament. There was just one problem. They started building it months before kickoff, and then it rained. For weeks. So when the first World Cup in history actually kicked off, its grand stadium was still a half-finished skeleton of wet concrete and scaffolding. And the opening matches had to be played somewhere else, somewhere very, very small. The first ever World Cup match was staged at a tiny ground called the Estadio Pochitos. It belonged to a Montevideo club, and it held barely 1,000 people. Picture it. The competition that would one day fill that 200,000-seat bowl in Rio, the tournament now watched by 5 billion people, began in a little neighborhood ground with wooden fences in front of a crowd you could fit into a single section of a modern stand. France beat Mexico 4-1. A factory worker named Lucien Laurent swung his boot and scored the first goal in the history of the World Cup, watched by perhaps a few thousand people, most of whom had no idea they were witnessing the birth of anything at all. And it got smaller still. The very next day, at that same little Pochitos ground, Romania played Peru. The official records list a couple of thousand spectators, but historians who studied the gate takings are sure the truth is far bleaker. On a cold winter afternoon, perhaps 300 people actually turned up to watch. 300. That is the lowest attendance for any match in World Cup history. The same competition that, 20 years later, would cram 200,000 into a single stadium, once played a game in front of a crowd smaller than a village wedding. When the Centenario was finally finished, 5 days into that first tournament, it became the proper home of the World Cup, and Uruguay won the final there in front of a roaring partisan crowd. Today, it is the only stadium on Earth that FIFA has named a historical monument of world football, the place where the whole beautiful madness was born. But it began, let us never forget, in a 1,000-seat club ground in the rain. For sheer scale, only one venue has ever truly rivaled the Maracanã. And it did it not with size alone, but with thin air. High above Mexico City sits the Estadio Azteca, a vast concrete bowl built into the landscape at over 2,200 meters above sea level, 7,000 feet. So high that visiting players, sprinting in the afternoon heat, would feel their lungs burning and their legs turning to lead while the locals ran on as if the air were perfectly normal. The Azteca was not just enormous, it was a weapon. It is the only stadium ever to host 2 World Cup finals, in 1970 and in 1986, and in 2026, it becomes the only ground in history to host the opening match of a World Cup 3 separate times. Stand in that bowl, and you are standing where the game's biggest legends were made. It was here, in the suffocating altitude of 1970, that one of the greatest teams ever assembled lifted the trophy. And it was here, 16 years later, that on a single June afternoon, in front of more than 114,000 people, the most argued over and the most beautiful goals in World Cup history were scored 4 minutes apart, by the same man, in the same match. The Azteca did not just host history, it manufactured it, and it made you climb into the clouds to watch. Which brings us, finally, back down to the small. Because for every cathedral, the World Cup has quietly used a chapel. In 1934, in Italy, matches were played in grounds that held only 8,000. 4 years later, in France, the tournament visited a sun-drenched little stadium on the Riviera with room for barely 7,000 souls. Even in 1950, the same year as the gigantic Maracanã, Brazil staged World Cup matches in a modest 10,000-capacity ground in the southern city of Curitiba. The same tournament, in the same country, in the same summer, could hold 200,000 people in one city and 10,000 in another. That is the strange, lopsided beauty of it. The World Cup has always been a story of extremes. There were other giants, of course, in the years between. In 1966, England won its only World Cup beneath the famous Twin Towers of Wembley, packed with nearly 97,000 people. In 1994, when the tournament crossed to the United States, the final was staged at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, where 94,000 sat under the California sun, the biggest crowd at any World Cup final since that lost afternoon in Rio. These were vast, magnificent arenas, and yet not one of them came close to the bare concrete immensity of the Maracana. The world had quietly decided that no stadium would ever again be allowed to hold that many people at once. And it still is. The modern game has its giants, all-seater monsters that hold 90,000. It has its intimate venues too, tucked into smaller cities, where the seats run out at 30,000 and the noise feels close enough to touch. But none of them will ever again do what the Maracana did in 1950. Safety, seating, regulation, and simple human decency have made certain of that. The 200,000 crowd is gone forever. It exists now only in grainy photographs, in the memories of the very old, and in that one impossible number that sits in the record books like a relic from another world. So the next time you watch a World Cup match, look past the players for a moment. Look at the building they are standing in. Look at the slope of the stands, the wall of faces, the sheer mad ambition of it, and remember the long line it descends from. The 1,000-seat club ground in the Montevideo rain. The 300 frozen souls who watched Romania and Peru. The bowl in the clouds that stole the breath from the world's best. And the 200,000 who stood on bare concrete in Rio and fell silent together in a single shattering heartbeat. The pitch is always the same size. Everything around it has been the difference between a whisper and a roar. Subscribe, and we'll keep bringing you these stories.